Victor had spent the whole night awake, unable to stop thinking about that orc tied up like an animal. His daughters had seen her and wouldn't stop talking. "Do something, Dad. Set her free, please. She doesn't deserve this." He looked at his sleeping girls and went to do the most reckless thing of his adult life. He saddled his horse, pulled his hood low, and rode an hour through the dark. He knew he had to arrive before sunrise, so no one would see what he was about to do. Tonight, the chains would fall. The morning that would change everything began like all the others, quietly, with the smell of frost on the grass and the sound of the old door creaking when Victor stepped outside to check on the animals. He was a man of few words and heavy silences, the kind who had learned long ago that talking too much never fixed anything. His hands were rough from years of working the land, but they remembered other things too. The grip of a sword, the weight of a shield, the cold mud of the Grey Marks campaign. He had put all of that away, or so he told himself. He had 2 daughters, Brina and Celeste, and a small farm an hour's ride from the village of Ashkvorn, far enough to be left alone, close enough to buy supplies when the coins ran out. The house creaked in the wind, the door swelled in the cold. The turnip stew was the same every week. But it was theirs, and he protected it as if it were gold. That morning, Victor loaded the girls into the cart and headed to the barter market at Ashkvorn. He needed nails, leather cord, and maybe a sack of barley if the coins stretched far enough. Celeste chattered the whole ride, the way she always did, while Brina sat quietly and watched the road, the way she always did. Victor kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The market was already alive when they arrived. Smoke from cook fires, the smell of old leather, the sound of bartering voices overlapping in the cold morning air. Victor tied the horse and started walking toward the tool stalls, a girl on each side of him. It was Celeste who saw her first. In the far corner of the market, tied to a rotting wooden post by the same merchant who sold rusted tools and poorly cured hides, stood a young orc. She was tall, with shoulders that had once been strong and now carried the weight of weeks without proper food. Her skin was the deep green of river jade, and her dark hair hung in loose, matted strands across her face. Around her wrist, a thick iron chain. Around her neck, a wooden tag with a price carved into it. Too high for any honest farmer, too low for any corrupt lord to bother with. So she stayed, day after day, from sunrise to the cold of night. No blanket. Not enough food. A half-filled bucket of water on the ground, the only thing her captor, a mercenary named Borgo Kyle, left for her. "Dad, look," Celeste said, tugging hard at his sleeve. "Don't look," Victor said, dry and flat, not breaking his stride, but Brina had already stopped. Her eyes moved slowly from the chain at the orc's wrist to her expression, not pleading, not angry, the face of someone who had stopped expecting anything. "It isn't fair," Brina said quietly. "She's tied up there, Dad. It isn't fair." Victor pulled them both forward without answering, but he had looked. For 1 second, just one, he had looked. And somewhere behind the wall, he had built inside himself, something moved. That night, dinner was silent. Celeste didn't touch her stew. Brina sat with her elbows on the table and her chin resting in both hands, staring at the candle flame as if waiting for it to say something. Victor ate slowly, not tasting much. "She was cold," Celeste said suddenly, to no one in particular. She was cold, and that man didn't even give her a blanket. Victor said nothing. He cleaned his bowl, set it aside, and sat at the table long after the girls had gone to bed. The wind pushed against the house walls. The iron stove clicked and popped. And inside his chest, a place he had learned to keep locked since his wife died 4 winters ago, something moved uncomfortably, like an ember that hadn't gone out the way it was supposed to. He knew that expression, the one the orc had worn at the market. He had seen it before, in the Grey Marks, on prisoners the soldiers dragged from village to village along the Scorrow Road. People who had stopped fighting, not from cowardness, but because no one around them had given them any reason to keep going. He had been a soldier long enough to know what that cost a person, and he had been a father long enough to know that his daughters had seen the same thing he had and would not forget it. He sat until the candle burned down to almost nothing. Then he stood, not in any rush, not with any great resolve on his face. He simply stood up, the way a man does when he has already made a decision and is just now letting his body follow. He went to the small chest beside the bed and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilskin cloth, was a short-bladed knife he had carried since the grey marks. He had kept it sharpened out of habit. He took it out and tucked it into his belt. Then he went to the barn. He saddled the horse in the dark, working by feel and memory, the way he had done on night patrols a long time ago. He pulled his hood up. He did not leave a note. There was nothing he could write that wouldn't sound like madness on paper. He rode out across the frozen fields of Durnvale Plain, the frost cracking softly under the horse's hooves, no lantern in his hand. He knew the way. The village of Ashkvorn was asleep. The market square was empty and dark, the stalls covered with canvas and shadow. Bogokale's tent sat at the far edge, a loose tarp tied badly to a rotting oak post. Kale was not a man who paid for storage. He left his merchandise where it stood, whether it was tools or living things. She was there, the orc from the market. Victor had known she would be. She wasn't sleeping. She sat on the bare earth, with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open in the dark. When she heard the horse's hooves, she went rigid. The instinct of someone who had learned that sound in the night rarely meant anything good. Victor dismounted slowly. He stepped into the pale moonlight so she could see him clearly before he came closer. He wanted her to see him before he moved. She watched him with narrow eyes, measuring. He said nothing. He pulled the short knife from his belt and knelt beside the chain. Not the padlock. Kyle slept with the key. But the iron ring was bolted into rotting wood, and 3 muffled strikes from a stone Victor had carried wrapped in cloth were enough. The ring cracked. The chain fell to the dirt without a sound. She did not stand immediately. She looked at him with an expression that was neither gratitude nor suspicion. It was the face of someone trying to understand whether what was happening was real. Victor pointed at the horse, then pointed north. Then placed his hand flat on his own chest. "My house," he said, low enough that no one sleeping nearby would hear. "1 hour from here. You don't have to stay, but tonight you don't stay here." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Freya," she said simply. Then she stood. They rode in silence. Victor held the reins and kept the horse at a slow, steady walk. Freya sat behind him, upright and careful, not gripping his coat any harder than she needed to. The frozen plain stretched out in every direction, pale and quiet, and the only sound was the soft rhythm of hooves on hardened earth. By the time they reached the farm, the sky in the east had the first grey smear of coming dawn. Victor brought the horse to the barn, dismounted, and helped her down without fuss. She was lighter than she should have been. That told him things no words would have. Inside the house, he stoked the stove and hung a pot of water. He found a blanket in the chest at the foot of his bed and handed it to her without ceremony. Freya took it and pulled it around her shoulders and stood close to the stove. Her eyes moved around the room carefully. The rough wooden walls, the 2 small doors leading to the girls' room, the table with its 4 mismatched chairs, 4 chairs for 3 people. She noticed that too. In the morning, when Brina opened her bedroom door and found a tall orc woman warming her hands at the stove, she stopped in the doorway and stared for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked past her, took a cup from the shelf, poured herself some water, and said, without looking up, "Did you eat yet?" "No," Freya said. Brina nodded, as if that were a perfectly satisfactory answer, and began cutting bread. Celeste, behind her, was less composed. She stood with her mouth slightly open until Brina elbowed her and told her to close it. Victor said nothing. He sat at the table with his own cup and watched his daughters decide things without being asked, the way they always did, and felt something in his chest settle, not quite warmth, but close to it. Freya ate slowly. She didn't speak much. And they didn't push her. But when Celeste slid the last heel of bread across the table toward her, without comment, Freya's hands paused over the plate for a moment longer than necessary before she picked it up. The days that followed had a quiet rhythm to them. Freya noticed the small things that told the story of this family, the mended patches on the girls' coats, stitched twice and carefully. The jar on the shelf labelled for the roof, coins set aside slowly for repairs that kept not happening, the absence in the fourth chair, the one at the corner of the table that no one sat in and no one moved. She did not ask about the girl's mother. She had heard enough silences in her life to know what a permanent one sounded like. One afternoon, she found Victor behind the barn, replacing a fence post with slow, deliberate movements. She watched him for a moment, then picked up the other end of the post without a word and held it steady while he drove it in. He glanced at her sideways, but said nothing. When the post was set, she said, "The wood along the east fence is rotting. It'll go before the next hard frost." "I know," he said. "I can fix it, if you have timber." "And there's timber in the barn." She nodded. "All right." That evening, while sweeping the yard before dark, Freya spotted something half-buried near the barn door, a flint striker, old and rusted, still solid beneath the grime. She picked it up, cleaned it against her sleeve, and set it on the kitchen shelf without saying a word about it. Victor saw it there when he came in. He didn't say anything either. One night, later that week, Celeste had trouble sleeping and came to sit at the table in the dark. She found Freya already there, watching the low fire in the stove. They sat together for a while without talking. Then Celeste leaned her head against Freya's arm, the way children do when sleep is pulling at them, but they don't want to be alone yet. Freya sat very still. She looked at the top of the girl's head, the small ear, the dark hair, the soft and completely trusting weight of her. She had not been any kind of safe place to anyone in a very long time. She sat there until Celeste drifted off, then carried her back to her bed with careful movements. She stood in the doorway of the girls' room for a moment, listening to them breathe. Then she went back to the table and sat with the low fire until the first grey light appeared in the window. The next morning, Victor went to the small chest beside his bed and took out the old pistol that had belonged to his wife, small-calibered and inelegant but maintained. He cleaned it that afternoon without ceremony, loaded it, and set it on the top shelf in the main room, within reach of anyone who might need it. He did not say it was for Freya. He just put it there and went back outside. She saw it that evening. She didn't say anything either. Several days had passed since the night he had ridden to Ashkvorn alone. The farm had settled into something that felt, if not permanent, at least solid. Freya had begun on the east fence the morning after they'd spoken about it, cutting timber in the barn and carrying posts out to the field with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood what needed doing and didn't need praise for doing it. Victor worked alongside her most mornings. They fell into the same rhythm easily, the way people do when they've both done hard labor before and know there's no need to talk about it. Celeste, who observed everything and forgot nothing, reported to Brina one evening in a loud whisper, "She fixed 3 whole sections today." Brina received this with the gravity it deserved. It was on the morning of the 5th day that Victor heard hoofbeats on the road. He was in the barn when the sound reached him. 2 horses, moving with the deliberate pace of men who weren't in a hurry because they believed they had no reason to be. He set down his tools without rushing, walked to the barn door and looked out. 2 riders in the yard entrance, Borgo Kale in front, wearing the same smirk he'd had at the market, the easy smile of a man who arrived, places expecting to be obeyed. Behind him, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a shotgun resting across his saddle, aimed carelessly, which was its own kind of warning. Victor stepped out into the center of the yard and stopped. He kept his hands loose at his sides. His eyes moved from Kale's face to the enforcer's weapon, measuring distances and angles the way they had taught him to do in the grey marks, where men died for failing to measure correctly. "Victor," Kyle said warmly, as if they were old friends. "I heard an interesting rumor. They say an orc has been staying at the veteran's house. Someone passing through said they saw her." He smiled wider. "You know she's still mine, don't you? You didn't buy anything." Victor said nothing. He let the silence stretch. "Give her back," Kyle continued, "and maybe I forget what you did. Otherwise—" He gestured toward the enforcer, who raised the gun barrel toward Victor. Victor nodded slowly, the nod of a man about to give in. He moved his hand toward the pouch at his belt, slow and deliberate, the way you'd reach for coins, and began walking toward the enforcer with heavy, unhurried steps. The enforcer didn't anticipate what came next. In one clean motion, Victor seized the shotgun barrel with his left hand and pulled sharply, yanking the man's balance forward. The enforcer stumbled. Victor turned with the man's own weight and drove him into the ground with a short, hard impact. The gun spun away into the mud. Kyle's horse sidestepped. His mouth opened. The enforcer tried to get up. Victor was already on top of him, and then they were rolling in the cold mud of the yard, elbows and knees hitting the frozen ground, the ugly and honest brutality of two men who had been hurt before and weren't afraid of it. Victor took a fist to the face. He returned too. When the enforcer ran out of breath beneath him, Victor twisted the man's arm up behind his back until he heard a grunt of surrender. Then he used his own leather belt to bind the man's wrists, pulling it free in one practiced motion. At that moment, the farmhouse door opened. Freya walked out with steady steps. She went straight to the top shelf, took the pistol Victor had left there, and came through the door with it raised and aimed directly at Borgo Kyle, who stiffened in his saddle, with his hands rising slowly, palms open. "Don't shoot, don't—" "Be quiet," Freya said. Her voice came out rough, but it didn't tremble. She walked until she was a few steps from his horse. Her eyes didn't move from his face, not for a second. Everything she had swallowed in the weeks of chain and cold and hunger and half-filled water buckets came up all at once, not as tears, not as screaming, but as something quieter and harder and far more permanent. "You treated me like an animal," she said slowly, so each word arrived whole. "You left me in the cold. You left me hungry. You tied me up as if I were nothing." She raised her chin. "But I am not like you. I never was." Kyle said nothing. For the first time since he had ridden into the yard, the smile was completely gone. Victor got up from the ground and wiped the mud from his face with the back of his hand. He walked to Kyle's horse without hurrying. He reached into his belt pouch and pulled out the only bag of silver coins he owned, the one he had been saving for months to fix the farmhouse roof. He threw it onto Kyle's lap without ceremony. "It's paid," Victor said. "Less than what you asked. But it's what I have. And it's more than you deserve." Kyle looked at the bag, then at the pistol, then at Victor. "She is not an animal," Victor continued, his voice low and final, the voice of a man stating fact rather than making a threat. "I hope you do not come back here, because next time there will be no deal." Then Victor turned to the bound enforcer on the ground and cut his wrists free. The man rose slowly, rubbing his wrists. He looked at Victor with different eyes, the look of someone who had finally understood what he was seeing. Victor's posture, the economy of the way he moved, the unhurried precision of a man who had fought many times and never once lost control. The enforcer recognized it the way soldiers recognize each other. I didn't know it was you, sir," he said, his head lowered. "Didn't know you were one of the veterans of the Grey Marks. I apologize." Victor didn't answer. He simply pointed at the horse. The two men mounted in silence. Kyle pressed the bag of silver to his chest and said nothing more. Then they rode out hard down the dirt road, hooves throwing up dust until the horses and their riders became a dark point on the horizon, and then nothing. The yard went quiet. Freya still held the pistol. Her arms shook slightly when she finally lowered it, not from weakness, but from the sudden flood of the moment ending. Victor approached slowly. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. Brina and Celeste appeared in the farmhouse doorway, arms wrapped around each other, eyes wide. Celeste came down the steps at a run and threw her arms around Victor's waist without warning. Brina walked to Freya and stood in front of her for a moment, then took her hand in both of her small ones and did not let go. The four of them stood in the yard as the dust from the road settled. The sun had climbed by now, pale and cold, cutting long shadows across the frozen ground. A crow called somewhere far off. The world came back one sound at a time, ordinary and unhurried, the way it always did after something that mattered. Victor made the stew. He didn't announce it. He simply went to the kitchen and moved around the small space with the ease of a man who had cooked every meal in this house for 4 winters. He found the last of the turnips and the piece of cured meat he had been saving and added them both without hesitation. 4 bowls, no discussion. When it was ready, he set them on the table and sat down. Celeste was already in her chair. Brina guided Freya to hers, the corner seat, the 4th chair, with a gentle hand at her elbow and the total certainty of someone who has decided something and sees no reason to explain it. They ate. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees. The stove kept the room warm. Steam rose from the bowls. No one made a speech. No one recounted what had happened. The food was plain and hot, and there was enough of it, and that was all it needed to be. Partway through the meal, Celeste looked up at Freya and said, "Is it good?" Freya considered this with apparent seriousness. "It's very good," she said. Celeste looked deeply satisfied and returned to her bowl. After the dishes were cleared, Brina brought out the small wooden box that lived on the shelf beside the window, the one with the cards and the mismatched game pieces that had accumulated over the years. She set it on the table without asking anyone's opinion and began sorting the pieces. Freya watched her. "What game?" "It doesn't have a name," Brina said. "We made up the rules." "Who wins?" Celeste raised her hand. "She cheats," Brina said calmly. "I don't cheat," Celeste said, with the easy confidence of someone who has been saying this for years. "I improvise." Something shifted in Freya's face. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Victor noticed it from the end of the table. He said nothing, watching his daughters explain the inexplicable rules of their invented game to a woman who had been chained to a post 5 days ago and who was now listening with genuine attention, her chin in her hand. Later, when the girls had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Victor poured 2 cups of water and set one in front of Freya without a word. They sat across from each other at the cleared table. "You could have left today," Victor said. "After Kale rode off, you were free." Freya looked at her cup. "I know. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "The east fence," she said finally. "It's going to go before the next frost. I said I'd fix it." He looked at her steadily. "The timber's in the barn. I know where it is." They sat with the silence for a while. The stove settled, the wind pressed against the north wall and moved on. Victor stood, rinsed his cup, and set it on the shelf. "Good night," he said. "Good night," Freya said. He went to bed. She stayed at the table a while longer, listening to the house breathe around her, the creak of the roof, the low tick of the cooling stove, the quiet sound of 2 girls sleeping on the other side of a thin wall. It was, she realized, the first time in a long while that silence had felt like something other than a threat. Winter came harder the following week. Snow crossed the Durnvale plain from the north, light at first, and then not. The ground hardened, the well rope stiffened in the mornings. Victor and Freya worked the east fence in the cold, cutting timber and setting posts, their breath coming in visible puffs, gloves crusted with frost by midday. They worked well together, not because they were alike, but because they both knew how to read a task without needing to talk through it first. Celeste brought them warm water in the afternoons, carefully, with both hands around the cup, enormously pleased with herself each time. Brina, for her part, had begun teaching Freya the mark script, the angular writing system used by soldiers and traders in the Northern Territories. She did this with the pedagogical seriousness of a child who has discovered she is good at something and intends to be thorough about it. Freya proved a quick student, which Brina accepted as the correct state of affairs. One evening, Freya sat with Celeste and showed her how to braid cord the way her clan had done, a flat, tight weave using 3 strands. Celeste picked it up almost immediately and declared she was going to make a bracelet for everyone in the house. By the time she finished the announcement, she was already counting fingers to determine how many that was. Victor watched from his corner. He thought about the coins he had thrown onto Kyle's lap. The roof would have to wait another year, maybe 2. He thought about this without bitterness. It was simply a fact, and he had learned long ago that facts adjusted themselves less than expectations did. What he hadn't expected, not a week ago, not a month ago, not at any point in the 4 quiet winters since his wife died, was this: a full table. A 4th chair that was no longer empty, the sound of an extra voice in the house, low and careful, learning when to speak and when to listen. Which was, Victor had always believed, the only real measure of a person. He did not say any of this out loud. He was not that kind of man. But he went to the small carved box on the high shelf, the one that held his wife's things, the ring and the folded letter and the button from her favorite coat. And next to it, he placed the flint striker that Freya had cleaned and left on the kitchen shelf without explanation. He set it there deliberately without examining why, and then went to bed. The snow fell through the night, soft and unrelenting, covering the yard and the new fence posts and the road to Ashkvorn in a smooth, clean white. By morning, the farm looked as if it had always been exactly this way, still, contained, and whole. A single shape against the wide, pale plain. Inside, the stove was already lit. Freya had gotten up first, stoked the fire, and put water on. She was standing at the window with a cup in her hands when Victor came out. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking at the snow, then at her, then at the snow again. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He went to pour his own water. She moved aside without needing to be asked, and neither of them remarked on any of it. By the time the first thaw came, the east fence was fully repaired, and the lean-to at the back of the barn had been re-shouldered with new timber. The farmhouse roof still needed work. It would, as it always did, have to wait. But the worst of the gaps had been packed with hemp and clay, which held against the worst of the snow. Freya did not announce that she was staying. There was no conversation where it was decided. It simply became true, the way things do when no one pushes against them. She learned where the spare rope was kept. She learned which floorboard near the back door stuck and had to be stepped over rather than on. She learned that Brina needed 2 cups of water in the morning before she was prepared to speak to anyone, and that Celeste needed to ask one question. Any question. The content didn't matter before she could settle into the day. She learned the sound the axle on the cart made when it was dry and needed grease, and she greased it without being told. Victor noticed all of this and said none of it. That was, as far as he was concerned, its own kind of answer. One afternoon, as the snow melted and the yard became mud and the mud began slowly to dry, Celeste pressed a cord bracelet into Freya's hand. It was the flat, tight weave she had been taught, 4 strands, because she had decided 4 was better than 3. In colours she had chosen herself. She had been working on it for 3 weeks. She presented it with the solemnity of someone awarding something that mattered very much. Freya looked at it for a moment. Then she held out her wrist. Celeste tied it on with fierce concentration, the tip of her tongue between her teeth. "There," she said, stepping back to observe her work. "Now you're part of the house." Freya looked at the bracelet, at the 4 strands twisted together. She looked at Celeste, who was already moving on to something else with the complete ease of someone who never doubted the outcome, who had decided this weeks ago and simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Freya looked at the bracelet for a long time. Then she went inside. That evening, Victor made the stew. Turnips, the same as always, with the last of the salted pork. And he served it in 4 bowls without counting, without thinking about it. The way you do things that have become the shape of your days. Brina sat in her chair, Celeste sat in hers, Freya sat in the fourth chair, the corner one, and pulled it slightly closer to the table. They ate. The fire in the stove was steady and low. The girls argued cheerfully about something that seemed to matter very much, and probably didn't. Outside, the first birds in weeks had returned to the yard, calling to each other in the grey afternoon light with small, ordinary urgency. After dinner, Freya stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the open fields of Durnvale Plain, the wide path of mud and melting snow that led away from the farm and toward everything else that existed in the world. She was free. She could go. She had been free since the night Victor broke the ring from the rotting post, and she had known it every day since. Brina appeared beside her, pressed her shoulder against Freya's arm without asking, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to be afraid of taking up space. Freya looked down at her, then at the horizon, then at the house behind her, the rough walls, the mended coats on the hooks, the 4 mismatched chairs around a table that had enough stew on it for everyone. She closed the door. From the inside. No contract was signed. No great words were said. Just silver coins thrown into the lap of a man who never deserved more than that, and a door closed from the inside, which is the only real way there is to say, this place is mine too. And that, in the grey marks, had always been the highest law. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.